Hey everyone, I want to take a quick look at a new book from Crossway that's kind of an it book right now in certain Christian circles, particularly more conservative or more reformed-ish circles. It's a little bit of a lightning rod maybe, but that is Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And like I mentioned, it just came out from Crossway just in November, so it's pretty new title. But I want to talk about what I think about this really interesting book. But before I do that, I'll just frame up, like I usually do, the main idea, comment on the research and the readability of it. But this is essentially, the main idea of this is a diagnosis of Western culture, kind of the cultural moment that we're in, from Trueman's perspective. So he is approaching the question, he's really framing it around one kind of core question, which is, how is it that in our culture the phrase, "I am a man trapped inside a woman's body," or you could flip it around, "I'm a woman trapped inside a man's body." He's asking the question, how has that phrase become a colloquialism? And not just a colloquial kind of accepted thing, like no one really bats an eye if you hear of someone saying that in our culture, but how is it that it's become so politically charged to such an extent that to deny the truth of that statement would be considered bigotry or a phobia or something? That's his main question, is how did we get there? How do we get to that place? It's reminiscent in some ways of Charles Taylor asking in A Secular Age, how did we go from where not believing in God was crazy to believing in God was crazy? It's kind of that scope of an argument, like how did we move from one place to another? How did we get here, culturally speaking? And to do that, just to really boil it down, the moves that Trueman is making here, is he simplifies the cultural kind of progression down to 3 stages. And these are keyed up pretty early in the book. So, I've heard him give these talks and stuff like that. So, his 3 kind of moves that he's contending are our conception of the self, who we are. It got psychologized, so there's an inward turn to a focus on psychology, and that he points to Rousseau as a key figure in that. So the self got psychologized. Secondly, psychology got sexualized through Freud is the most obvious example of that. And then thirdly, sexuality or sex got politicized, and then he points to Herbert Marcuse of the critical theory in Frankfurt School. So again, it's complicated stuff, but he boils it down into this: the self got psychologized, psychology got sexualized, and then sex got politicized. And he traces those 3 movements through the course of the book. Okay, that's the main idea. I'm going to try to move quickly through these next things, but Trueman's research is it's really solid, the figures he pulls on. And one of the things I appreciated the most about his book is he's not building up a straw man, or he's not engaging on a shallow level with any of these thinkers. In particular, I found his chapters on Rousseau and Marcuse to be really good. His unpacking of Rousseau's thought is really helpful. He has a whole chapter, in addition to Rousseau, on the Romantic poets, the Romantic movement in poetry. And you just get a sense from reading him that he really understands the thinkers he's engaging with, which I deeply appreciate, especially he's coming from a quite conservative perspective, and that doesn't always happen from either side. When you read a book and you get a sense of, like, I don't think this person really understands the depths to which this thinker is actually engaged. But Trueman is not guilty of that, thankfully. It was refreshing. And like I said, his chapter on Rousseau is one of my favorites in the book, actually. And his reading of Marcuse and his reading of critical theory in general is much more nuanced than a lot of what conservative Christians the dialogue and rhetoric in our culture right now. He actually you get the feeling that he understands the people he's commenting on, which goes a long way to building up credibility, at least for me as a reader. So that's a little bit about his research. I mean, he knows his stuff. He did his homework. And then the readability, this I found it quite readable, but it might be a little bit of a mixed bag. This depending on how much you are comfortable reading philosophy, especially. Because part of what goes with the good research I mentioned a minute ago is it's not always the easiest to read, because he pulls on really big quotations of texts. People like Marcuse are not super easy to read. So you've got to be willing to do a little bit of work to get through some of that. And also the scope of his argument is huge. I mean, he's making an argument about Western culture as a whole, where we've come from, how did we get here, and anything that's that big in scope is just gonna, if it's gonna be thoughtfully done at all, and this is thoughtfully done, it takes some work to read through. So you've got to be willing to dive into that. And I do worry that because this book is getting so much attention, I worry that maybe prospective readers might grab it thinking it's going to be an easy read, and it's not super easy. It's pretty long. It's about 400 plus pages. So that being said, for the depth to which he's engaging, I found it actually pretty enjoyable to read. He's not engaging in, and I'll say a little bit more about this in my final thoughts in a second, but he's not engaging in an angry polemic or just like this hopeless, despairing lament. It's nothing like that. It's really just, and he's very upfront about this, it's really just, let's take a clear-eyed look about how we got here as a culture. And here are some thinkers that I think really shaped the narrative in Trueman's perspective. So it is pretty rigorous in its research. It's pretty deep. It's a big scope of argument, but it's actually pretty enjoyable to read if you're willing to put in some work to really chew on some of these thinkers. So what are my final thoughts on this book? I really, really appreciated this book, and I genuinely think it's an excellent book overall. I'm keeping it on my shelf. I'm going to put it right next to Charles Taylor, actually, because it goes really, really. It's a complementary kind of conversation piece to a lot of what Taylor's done, and Taylor's one of my favorites. So I think it's a fantastic book on philosophical history, and there is some good cultural criticism in there. It's generally devoid of polemic. There isn't a lot of really anger or anything. You don't get that from his writing. He takes a couple swipes at a few people here and there, but I'm willing to forgive that because I think he does a really good job at not gauging into the fight so much. It's really, like I said, just let's look at our culture. Let's try to think really hard about how we got here. Now, I do think, and I think this is important, I don't think it's the whole story. I don't know that Trueman would say it's the whole story. You gotta simplify and contain somewhere. But I do think there's an important piece missing. I think he does not engage with the role the Protestant Reformation may have played in all this, which is where I think someone like Charles Taylor is really important. So Trueman he's an unabashed, unapologetic Protestant. He's Reformed. He's part of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So he kind of it doesn't talk that much about the Reformation, but I think there's a strong argument to be made that the Reformation itself, the Protestant Reformation, may have actually furthered some of these trends he's talking about conceptions of the self, right? I think there's a pretty strong argument that can be made there that he kind of doesn't really include in his argument. And also just the Protestant response to the Catholic sacramentality kind of conception of the world. I think that's an important thing to consider too if you're going to talk about how Western culture is formed, and he doesn't talk about that. So I think it's in some ways a missing piece, not necessarily a criticism of the book per se, because he's trying to provide a Protestant look at culture, but I do think that prospective readers should know that that's missing and that there's other writers who talk about the Reformation, notably Charles Taylor, like I said, who talk about the role the Reformation might have played. So it's a great book on what he's trying to say, but it's not the whole, I wouldn't say it's the whole story. And the last thing I'll say about this, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to feature it, in my little corner of the internet here. I think this is a good book, and I'm worried, but I'm worried it's going to get weaponized in the culture war. I don't think Trueman would want that to happen per se, but because he's so conservative and because he's making an explicitly kind of reformed Protestant argument, I worry that certain circles of particularly conservative Christian culture, subcultures, might weaponize this in their own war on Western culture and use it to further their own, maybe almost militaristic view of we got to fight Western culture, we got to fight back these trends. And I really would hate to see that happen, because if that happens and it gets lumped in with that mindset, it's going to get ignored. I worry it would get ignored by thoughtful readers. So I hope that makes sense. It's not at all a fault of the book. It's more a comment on our culture and how our culture might tend to use pieces like this. But I think this is a really thoughtful book. I'm really glad Trueman wrote it. I'm glad that he did his homework. It's a fair argument. It's a fair piece of cultural criticism, and it's a really excellent summary of some really important thinkers in Western history. So if any of that sounds of interest to you, and maybe you've been turned off by the Gospel Coalition or I don't know, someone who has been publicizing this book, or maybe whatever, maybe give it a second look. Maybe push through that, take an honest read of it, and see what you think, because I really appreciated it. So thanks for watching. I'll see you for my next review.